Hello and welcome to the Great Telco Debate 2020 and our third topic for this year's event. The Open Telco, how do we harness the innovation required to revamp the network? Well, returning for the seventh outing of the annual Great Telco Debate are Chris Lewis and Graham Wild. Welcome again, both of you.
Great to be here.
Absolute pleasure, Guy.
Now, in a moment, we'll introduce our industry guests, our expert witnesses who will give their views on the topic, and then we'll present our motion. And it's this motion that we want you to vote on, either for or against. And Chris and Graham will do some last-minute persuasion to support their views. Graham, what's the premise behind today's topic?
So, Guy, the topic today is really around open technology in the telco space and the degree to which that opens up the telco technology space for innovation, for smaller players to come in, and for telcos to differentiate themselves by having a broader supplier base, and how much that plays against the other trend that's happening in the telco market, which is the simplification of the supplier base and to have fewer suppliers. So open technology, is it going to help? Is it going to broaden the supplier base, broaden innovation, or is it not really going to help? That's what this is about.
I wonder. We look forward to finding out. Thank you, Graham. Well, time now to introduce our industry guests who will be providing their expert witness statements. And I would like to welcome Nathan Rader, who is VP Cloudified Production with Deutsche Telekom, Tony Scales, who is Head of 5G Program Development at the UK DCMS, Darrell Jordan-Smith, Senior Vice President Industries and Global Accounts for Red Hat, Joe Whitel, who is Chief Technology Officer at Worldwide Technology, and Mike Wolet, who is Senior Director Engineering Operations at NetNumber. Hello everybody and welcome to the Great Telco Debate 2020. Chris, over to you to start off the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Guy, and delighted to have all of you with us for another part of the debate. What we're aiming to do in the Great Telco Debate is to try and get as many perspectives in front of our audience to help them decide not only on the motion that we'll put forward later on, but also just around helping them making decisions around their own businesses. So the perspectives you're about to hear in the witness statements, I think will help shape that, and then we'll go through a bit of question and answer just to clarify some of those issues. So I'm delighted to start off. Nathan, would you please share with us the position on the open telco from a Deutsche Telekom perspective?
In my opinion, all in the future are going to have some sort of element of openness. I see there are kind of three different types of open as it stands today. There's open technologies, there's open software, and there's open source. And if we kind of focus on each one of those and why they're valuable for telcos like Deutsche Telekom, open technologies, as far as open hardware, open RAN, and some of the open technologies of the future where we can get open fronthaul and have a more kind of vibrant ecosystem are going to be very valuable for us. As far as things like open software, there's a lot of work going on with open APIs, with various open projects to expand upon the ecosystem, enhance the ecosystem with openness. And then, of course, there's open source and open source technologies such as ORAN, as Kubernetes, as OpenStack, and all of these cloud-related technologies that we're using within Deutsche Telekom. I think that open is going to be very valuable for us for the future as we kind of move our way towards a software-defined telco. However, I also believe that in the open ecosystem, there is an element of lock-in still. You're always going to have the case where you still are locked into a technology, even if it's open. You still are going to have the challenges of transitioning away from that technology, whether it be, via training out new vendors, via having to use more systems integration resources to move out of that. And you may not be locked in by a proprietary piece of software, but ultimately you're still locked in by the fact that you've made a deployment there and there is an effort to move things forward. The other thing is I think we need to start looking at in the open ecosystem is avoiding the hijacking of the word open. I think there's a lot of people that are trying to tack open onto everything as a more marketing terminology and getting away from the fact of the actual kind of true openness that was started there. And so I think we just need to watch out for that. Open is going to be very valuable for us as a telco, but we should work to ensure that we use only the correct way and don't let us get trapped by the open and the misuse of open.
Thank you very much indeed, Nathan. You've introduced many different aspects of open that I'm sure we'll come back to during the rest of the session here, perhaps even the definition of open equating to honesty. So Tony, could you perhaps now share with us the perspective from the DCMS and how a government department and trying to encourage openness and trying to drive that whole 5G environment from your point of view?
Thanks, Chris. I think we've been talking about open telcos probably for 20 years or more. And whilst some progress has been made, I think we've still got quite a long way to go before we could consider the job done. I think I'll have a crack at my definition of open really from the perspective of where we started, which was telcos back in the day were fully vertically integrated operators that supplied fixed and mobile access and minutes to their customers. And to support that, they built a stack of monolithic systems, BSS, OSS, to support and manage those customers' accounts and billing, with software releases once every few months. With the advent of the internet, they did their best to do the same thing by creating walled gardens. And although they would have described some of the organizations they work within the walled garden as partners, effectively they were charging them a premium to access their customers. And their systems didn't really move very far with that. Again, they were serving access in kilobytes instead of minutes. FreeServe came along and that was the end of that game. Skype and others arrived to attack the telcos in their own backyard of voice and text, etc. Then along came the rest, the Amazons, the eBays, the Facebooks, Googles, and Ubers and Netflix with the platform economy, and showed how very powerful that's been at allowing them to capture revenues from where the telcos would have seen as their own natural territory. They also brought the platform play with modern software, agile, DevOps, microservices architectures, AI, machine learning, and that open partner-focused business model. Microservices play a big role in that ability to change quickly, and that was very, very important to those companies in their ability to move fast and capture revenues from others. And as a result, since around the mid 2000s and 2010s, the M&O revenues and margins have remained pretty much flat or declined, despite significant investment in new mobile generations and infrastructure. The telcos and their systems have responded by introducing the principles of open APIs to expose their systems and their data to others to varying degrees of depth. So in the sort of the thin MVNO style model, a partner can manage a billing relationship or a billing and CRM relationship with a customer, but can't really affect the customer experience in any way, nor the network itself. That's something which I think that TM Forum has really been pushing hard with the Open API Manifesto, now signed up to many of the global telcos. So that's really beginning to change things, I think, somewhat. And combining that with the work TM Forum was also done on business partnership, that's now creating a blueprint and a roadmap to transform businesses to a much more FANG-like model. But again, we're not there yet. Open RAN, it's really an interface definition, represents a real chance for telcos to enhance, enrich their supply chains, reduce operating costs, improve resilience and innovation. DCMS is leading through the Telecoms Diversification Task Force and Programme, and the UK MNOs are all engaged in those processes and appear keen to fully embrace the opportunities Open RAN can bring. But to be fully open, the telcos will also need to open their cores. 5G brings along much more software-defined networks and network slicing, which should enable telcos to offer a much deeper experience of partnership for their collaborators in the future. I think that's really where we need to head to get to a much more innovative answer and for the way the telcos operate. I think that's probably enough for now.
Thank you, Tony, very much. Darrell, coming on to Red Hat, obviously you're exposed with your activities and your services and your software to a wide range of telcos around the world. How do you see the open telco from the Red Hat perspective?
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, first of all, I want to echo a little bit of what Nathan was talking about, the three opens. There's open technology that people use to deploy applications and services in their business. There is open APIs, which are necessary for companies to integrate to. And then there's open source. And obviously, Red Hat being a very open source company, we're very focused on that element and how do we access APIs and how do we actually work with other proprietary-based software elements which are open in their own right. And what we're seeing in the marketplace at this moment in time is an acceleration of how people want to engage these technologies, because I think as one of the other members talked about earlier in the conversation is that we've been at this for many, many years, and we haven't really in the telecommunications space actually made much progress. And I think that, with very recent times, we've seen an acceleration of that progress in terms of the use of open technologies, particularly in the field that I'm very focused on in open source, as a development methodology to deliver agile applications, agile services, reduce operational costs, and drive towards a nirvana, if you like, of something that people are calling no-ops. i.e. The ability to operate a network infrastructure without having a lot of operational expenditure, which is a nirvana I don't think we'll ever get to, pure no-ops. But lots of telecommunications companies are looking at their operational elements and structures in order to lower their overall costs, to accelerate investments in deploying next-generation network infrastructures such as 5G. So there are a lot of strategies that are happening in the marketplace to look at that. One is, doing a right-hand turn to put everything into the cloud. And then there are regulatory issues associated with potential use of data in those instances. And what about the other applications and services that need to interface through those APIs, such as AI-based services and machine learning-based services that enable new sets of applications to be created that deliver that no-ops experience, as well as new applications in terms of delivering new services. So we're certainly seeing that right-hand turn into the cloud as being something that is very prevalent. We don't feel that many of the service providers have really figured out what that really means, as I said, from a data and regulatory perspective, but also what it means from a business perspective. So, for example, do you just go to one hyperscale provider versus another hyperscale provider? What about the tooling? What about the continuous integration, the agility of those environments? All of these questions are still there, but I think from what we're seeing is, service providers are being forced to accelerate elements in those areas, and they're using open as a mechanism to work with different vendors in those scenarios. So what we're very keen to advocate for is obviously open source. We see that as a way of bringing innovation in to develop applications and services on that common infrastructure. We're seeing the acceleration of a lot of ISVs and traditional network equipment providers building their workload-based environments to operate within those different ecosystems due to the openness that they provide, in order for customers to minimize the amount of the lock-in effect, as I think one of my colleagues just mentioned, that exists. So they have the flexibility to deliver a horizontal platform, as well as being able to innovate across that with the skills and services that they would have using open interfaces and agile methodologies, which are available in the marketplace today. So from our perspective, we see an opportunity to deliver lower cost, speed to market in terms of new services, more open in terms of competitive landscape and innovation that would potentially bring, as well as participating themselves in many of these big service providers contribute a lot of the code into the open source arena and make open APIs possible. We see that accelerating at an increased pace. So it's quite an exciting time.
Thank you, Darrell, and thank you for sharing the Red Hat perspective on what is an increasingly active and accelerating open area. Joe, I'd now like to turn to you and get from you the perspective of WWT and perhaps explain the way you fit in between some of the suppliers and some of the service providers and how you see the marketplace.
Certainly, Chris. Thank you so much for having me on the show today. And, fundamentally, I think the service provider's motivation for embracing openness is really being driven by their perceived business priority to become more agile in terms of delivering new services to their customer base, both enterprise and consumer customers. And when you think about openness, it's a very broad term. And you can start on one side where you've got vertically integrated solutions from a single vendor who will bring that to the service provider, deploy it, and operate it for them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've actually got service providers now building their own software, their own hardware, and operating it themselves. And I think as with most situations, what you'll see the industry follow is something in the middle. And I think in the middle, what you're going to find is service providers building a technology stack that ultimately is going to deliver a set of services to their customer base. And I think the need for open APIs to enable the integration of these various layers is going to be incredibly important. But I also think one of the big gaps that the service providers are facing is their own internal integration capability. I think that in many cases, the service providers have relied on the vendors over the past many years to do that integration work for them. And so I believe that's an ability that they have to create. Obviously, they can work with partners in the industry. That's where WWT sits as an integration partner. But I do think that for the service providers to be successful in the open world, where they're going to work with a variety of vendors, whether it's more traditional vendors, startups, and build out this layered infrastructure, layered stack, it's going to be really important for them to be able to handle that integration effort, once again, either internally or externally. In addition, I think there's going to be a lot of thought given by the service providers as to where they want to spend the majority of their time and resources. I think Darrell mentioned there's been a lot of work over the past many years in terms of service providers really building out an infrastructure platform. And I don't think the service providers feel they've received the return on investment that they would have hoped to achieve there. And so I think that in many cases, the service providers may start to believe that they need to focus on the services that are actually touching their customers and delivering revenue and profit growth for them, as opposed to focusing on the infrastructure that really doesn't touch their customers. It's an important part of the solution, but may not be core to their business in terms of what they need to deliver to that end customer. And so I think, once again, as some of my colleagues mentioned, there's going to be this introspection about what do they do in the infrastructure space. Once again, Darrell mentioned that there's a lot of thought around working with the public cloud providers. I do think over the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to see a lot of service providers embrace technology from those public cloud providers. That may not mean that the public cloud providers actually host service provider applications and network functions in their public data centers. That technology may actually be moved into the service provider central offices, and that may be where the service providers then build the services on top of those technologies. But I do think you'll see over the next several years an embrace of things like, Amazon Outpost and Wavelength, Azure Edge Zones, Google Anthos, in addition to new services from folks like Red Hat and IBM and their new cloud service. So I think that's going to be something that becomes more prevalent over the next several years. When that happens, I think the service providers are going to naturally have to focus on what business they actually want to be in. Because if they no longer are focused on building out this core infrastructure for themselves, I think they're definitely going to have to get much more focused on what their end customers want to consume from them from a technology perspective and a service perspective. And I think that's going to drive them to have a much more outside-in view of their customer base than they've had before. I think if they're particularly going to want to sell into the enterprise, they're going to have to be much more knowledgeable about what's happening in different industry verticals, whether it's manufacturing, healthcare, retail, and what business problems those enterprise customers are trying to solve. And so I think that's another skill set that the service providers are largely going to have to create and build. I think there are pockets of that in the industry, but I think that's an area where there'll be an increased focus in terms of, once again, what are those business problems that we need to help our enterprise customers try to solve? So I think there's going to be a lot of transformation in the industry over the next several years. It's going to be a very exciting time in the industry. I'm really looking forward to the opportunities that's going to provide to all of us. And I look forward to hearing more from everybody throughout the debate.
Thank you, Joe. One of the things you bring up there is really important, is the intersection and the overlapping between several of the debates which we have during the Great Telco debate. So certainly there's plenty more discussion around that on the hyperscale debate and whether telcos and hyperscalers can play nicely together. So watch out for that one. Finally, but of course not by any means least, Mike, can we turn to you, please? And from the net number perspective, how do you see this question of openness? We've had many definitions already. How does it affect what net number's doing with your customers?
Thank you, Chris. So as I think about the concept of open, as a basis for that, there's this idea of accessibility. Accessibility comes in forms of open APIs, open source software. But really, this opens the door to a landscape where there are more vendors and more choice for operators. I think another aspect of open that's worth touching upon here is a key aspect to success around collaboration between operators and vendors. I think in order to be successful here, the vendors and the operators will begin to form deeper collaborative relationships, and we'll see a greater sharing of ideas and vision and strategy from operators and vendors alike. And there'll be learning that's to be had on both sides of that relationship. As vendors and operators work more closely together to innovate, integrate, verify, and deploy, we'll see a driving force and acceleration of new service offerings in this open landscape. Now, of course, from the operator's perspective, in order to maintain such deep and collaborative relationships with their vendors will require a large time commitment. Operators will seek, I think, to maximize the value of these investments, and will seek to work with vendors who provide multiple service offerings within their domain. This will inherently also help minimize any challenges that may be had with onboarding or interoperability challenges that we experience today. So I think that what we'll see out of this is a choice of quality vendors over a large quantity of vendors. Now, certainly the availability of open APIs and open source software will make the vendor landscape more competitive. In order to be victorious here, I think operators and vendors will work together in a rapidly innovating strategy. So really those relationships that allow value to be delivered quickly and safely will be the ones that are most interesting and ultimately come out on top, I think. There are a few characteristics which are advantageous in these types of relationships that will really be the key to success here. And it's not necessarily just about the tools. Sure, automation, DevOps culture and mindset, CI/CD practices are all necessary in order to help deploy quickly and safely. But really going back to culture, there's a notion of an agile mindset that's really needed here. Vendors and operators alike, I think, need to continually inspect and adapt their work to allow them to adjust and change to changing requirements on the fly and as needed. So in the end, really, the mindset and culture of continual improvement, I think will really be a key factor here in helping migrate this continually changing landscape that comes with more open APIs and open source technology.
Thank you very much, Mike. Yes, I think by talking more and more about the openness and APIs, you introduce the issue of how do we pass data between all these different, formerly very separate silos and separate parts of the business, and of course between partners and more collaboration between the suppliers. So I'm sure we will come back to that either during the Q&A session now, or indeed when we start getting questions from the broader audience and the live event later on. So if I might come back to you, Nathan, you talked about the Deutsche Telekom's approach and the different definitions, three sort of areas of openness. Can you put any sort of priority on that in where you're putting more emphasis in the short term? And I think what's come out from all of the discussions is this is a very wide-ranging issue, and it affects pretty much every part of the organisation. Can you put any priority on openness from a Deutsche Telekom perspective?
I don't think so. I mean, open priority is obviously one of the first things we're looking at. And if we look at the three different kind of aspects of open that I brought forward, in most of our projects, we're incorporating all three. If you look at ORAN, for instance, ORAN, we're building an open source cloud. We're using open APIs and open software. And of course, we're looking to do that with open technology such as open fronthaul, potentially looking at an open ecosystem of additional vendors and things. So I don't think we can really prioritize it other than to say that open is a priority for us all the way along. And if you look back through our history, that's been a key driver for most things. That was the driver for kicking off the whole concept of network function virtualization. That's the whole concept of kicking off the concept of ORAN and Open RAN. So for us, it's a key driver, in almost everything we do.
And to bring in sort of Mike's point there about the open mindset, how have you gone about that within Deutsche Telekom? This is a significant shift from the old telco mentality of build it and eventually they will come. So can you give us some insight into that, how you've changed that mindset internally?
I think that's the biggest challenge, right? The open mindset and the changing, the modern ways of working, agile transformation, software defined telco. Ultimately, people and processes are the hardest portion of the transformation. It's quite easy to just look and say, yes, we're going to use open technologies. Yes, we're going to use open software. Yes, we're going to use open source. Components and software programs, but ultimately, the people and processes, the open transformation, as far as these modern ways, that is the difficult beast. We are still working on that, but we are making progress every day, and we are ambitious in the fact that we want to have this open mindset transformation.
And of course, one positive side effect that we've seen in many telcos is that it starts to make people feel more ownership of the whole organization and the whole way the service gets delivered to the customer. So people get buy-in because they're not so isolated in their technology pigeonholes as they perhaps would have been before. So I think I agree. It's a challenge, but it certainly gives benefits all around. And Tony, from a DCMS point of view, and thinking about sort of UK PLC and perhaps any thoughts you have around the sort of supplier ecosystem and any recommendations to other countries and other people. I mean, how does this really impact what you're trying to achieve and the relationship you have with the telecoms providers?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think from a government perspective, we've set out our stall pretty clearly that it's going to be really important that the UK has a broad and secure, diverse, resilient supply chain, and that at the moment the focus is clearly on the RAN, but I think that is going to shift upstream to the core as well over time. I'm sure that will happen. But this is clearly of national security importance. It's of geopolitical importance, and it's of economic importance to us as a UK economy that we can take best advantage of the latest technology that's out there. I think the telcos open. I think Nathan described what was essentially an open culture, and I think that that's a very important one. Telcos have been seen over time as trusted brands for their customers, and they are custodians of a lot of customer data, and not only of their own services but also of services that get delivered through their platforms. So I think there's a massive emphasis on telcos and a responsibility to be open and transparent about the processes they're using to protect their customers' data, and the technology is all part of that. But it certainly doesn't end with just with the tech. So I think we are very concerned in DCMS with protecting citizens from any kind of online harms, making sure that the UK has access to the very best technology that's available, whether that's 5G or AI or fiber delivered technology. It doesn't really matter, but that the applications are there, they're available, and that they're available in a resilient and productive way. So it's up to the telcos then to make that happen, and the market to support them in doing so. I think there was a time when I remember when back in the day I worked at BT when we built our own compilers for languages. We built our own hardware. We had our own PCs. I think those days are gone. I think that the telcos now understand what sorts of businesses they want to be, and the role they want to play in the market. And I think they do understand that partnership is a big part of that. And if they're going to do partnership, they've got to be open companies, open in culture, open in commercially, open in terms of contracts that they work with, and in terms of the tech that they're interchanging customer data on, that they're interchanging data about their networks and what's going on in them. The telcos in the UK have had a RAN-based partnership for quite some time, where the four operators have shared two RAN platforms at the physical and upwards layers of the network. So they are used to doing that, and they're going to do more of it. And the shared rural network is a good example of how they're going to do that in the future to make sure that there is a broad and widespread access to that tech in the future.
And I think one interesting side effect of the corona situation is we've actually seen a lot more collaboration on a technical level. I mean, people literally going into data centers and doing work on behalf of other operators. So there's perhaps the glimpse of a little more cooperation on that organisational side between the telcos as well. But thank you, Tony, for that very much. Darrell, you talked about the changing nature of the industry and new priorities. Do you see that with this more open environment that slightly contradictorily it requires more specialisation from vendors?
I believe to a certain degree, I think so. I think that vendors need to go a lot deeper in terms of what they're trying to derive from the business, in terms of the value that they're trying to deliver to the service provider. Also, as Joe was saying earlier, the service provider needs to go deeper into what their customers are looking for with some of those newer applications and the innovation that open brings. And that's the other point I really wanted to make is, we're doing things in an open way to speed up innovation. In order to speed it up, you also have, cultural issues associated with driving that. And one can't underestimate the cultural elements of that with the technological elements. They kind of have to go hand in hand. And really sort of coming back to, the core question that you had is, do vendors need to specialize? Yes, they do. They need to also take into consideration why they're delivering open technologies in conjunction also with the cultural changes that those technologies impose on a lot of the customers that are in trying to deploy them. In many of the service providers that we see around the globe, that is the number one question is how do they, embrace open? How do they innovate around open? Because that's the core reason why they want to do it. And how do they drive that cultural acceptance as well as responsibility in terms of the data that openness actually creates in terms of the way that you allow different applications and services to interface with that, particularly as we build out AI, artificial intelligence, as next generation applications and services in this space.
Thank you, Darrell. And Joe, to come back to you from WWT, the requirements placed upon you, given that sort of specialization that Darrell just touched upon, how does that affect your business in terms of the personnel, the recruitment, the skills, the technology you need to have at your disposal to be able to address to what we know is a wide variety of needs, whether it's in North America, in Europe, in Asia. We know every country is different. We know every telco is slightly different. Can you provide that scale of specialization and knowledge across the piece?
Chris, that's a great question. I think, as with any business, it all comes down to prioritization. I think that, what we're really trying to do is take a look at areas where our customers are trying to invest and to, move into the market. And we're trying to ensure that we're not only bringing technical resources, personnel, but also facilities, labs, integration centers, managed services capabilities that support those priorities. So I do think the age of a single vendor supplier that can be everything to everybody is done. I think it's going to be too complex for anybody to raise their hand and say they can support everything that the service providers need to accomplish. So much of this is really around understanding what the service providers are trying to accomplish, our joint customers, and then what skill sets, what capabilities, what assets we have that we can overlay across those needs and deliver the best value proposition. So we're heavily investing in a few areas that we believe WWT can bring unique value proposition, largely around the integration effort that I mentioned. Things like Open RAN, edge computing, private LTE, private 5G. We think that the integration effort, the services that are going to be required to help the service providers deploy and operate, and potentially even deploy and operate on an enterprise customer's premise, are things that we can specifically deliver as a unique value proposition. But it really does come down to placing bets in terms of where the industry is going and investing heavily in those areas where you want to deliver something unique to your customer base.
Thanks very much, Joe. And I think what that does bring out is this notion that if we're going to be reusing these chunks of code, chunks of technology, that it's not just the big telcos that will be at an advantage. The tier 2 and tier 3s will be able to take many of those components and consume them in a way that will certainly make them look very much like some of those larger corporate telcos. So I think we're going to see an interesting competitive landscape from the telco point of view, as well as that ecosystem you described there on the supplier side.
The tier 2, tier 3 kind of rural operators, I think they're definitely more open to what I would say is buying something off the shelf or pre-integrated. They obviously don't have the large staff to do a lot of this integration work. And so a go-to-market effort with those customers is definitely different than a go-to-market effort for the tier 1 operators, who obviously have a large engineering staff and can do some of this integration work themselves. They're going to want to make independent decisions around different pieces of technology, whether hardware or software. So I think that is important for the industry to think about the different go-to-market methodologies that are required for the different types of customers.
Thank you, Joe. And it is important because that there are many telcos of many different sizes out there. And to take up your point, perhaps they don't have the major staff that could deliver it, but nor do they have that major middle management who might get in the way of actually deploying it in the first place. So I think there are some advantages certainly down at the tier 2 or 3 area. So Mike, if I might come back to you, you talked a lot about the sort of the open APIs and this sort of flow of data. Is that something that you see as being sort of the primary result of this openness, that actually we get much greater visibility of the information about the customers, about the network, and that will put the telcos in a more favorable position than perhaps they've been in the past?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Chris. I think that this idea of being open and fostering these deeper relationships between operators and the vendors will lead to exactly that, like you described. This sharing of ideas, collaboration, sharing of vision, taking feedback, constantly inspecting and adapting the approaches to adjust to a changing landscape will certainly be critical. So this plays a lot into concepts such as agile transformations, ideas around continual improvement, but absolutely this deeper collaboration between the operators and the vendors is really what will drive innovation moving forward here.
Thank you, Mike. And that brings us to this notion of not only a more open environment, a more open ecosystem, but actually the importance of that openness of the relationship and understanding what is done. So moving away from the days of the black box and the mysterious technology that we might have had in the past and towards that more open, sharing the responsibility both of how the infrastructure and the platform gets built, but more importantly, how the service gets delivered all the way down to the end customer, whatever model that customer may be consuming those services in. So I'd like to thank very much all of the witnesses there. Thank you for your contributions. And I'd like to hand back to Guy.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And as you say, to all of our experts here, some great views and perspectives. Okay, you've been presented with the facts and now we want you to participate. You may have your own questions for our witnesses, in which case send them in and we'll include them in our live show on Tuesday, December the 8th at 4 p.m. UK time. And of course, we want your vote. But first, we need the motion.
And the motion is, a more open telco is at odds with the simplification of the supplier roster.
Well, that's our motion. Chris and Graham have tossed the great telco debate commemorative coin to see who's going to speak for the motion and who's going to speak against the motion. Chris, I see that you've won this time around and you'll be speaking first and presenting your views for the motion.
Thank you, Guy. The question of the open telco is on everybody's lips. We want to benefit from open services, we want to benefit from open technology, benefit from open platforms. But this is fundamentally, in my mind, against the simplification that is required in the way in which telcos build, operate and manage the services delivered into the industry and into the broader economy. We've been through the issues of best of breed and best of suite. This takes it to another level. We don't need to emphasize what's going on within the telecom organization. We need to simplify that. And in my mind, that's at odds with having a wide range, a plethora of suppliers feeding into the ecosystem. What we require is skills and knowledge and integration capabilities that exist within the larger organizations. It's their knowledge that will bring the services to the fore. We hear about this much more widely in the open business sector when we talk about the vertical market requirements. Here, we need the vertical market requirements of the telcos. Some telcos have that integration knowledge in-house and some will try and do that themselves. For the vast majority, however, I believe that we're going to have a shortened supplier roster in order to deliver against the services requirement of the future.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for sharing why we should vote for the motion. It's Graham's turn now to present his views as to why we should vote against the motion.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you, Chris. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to vote against the motion. And the reason is this. It's not incompatible to have an open architecture with a number of different players bringing innovation, which is aligned to customer requirements. That is not incompatible with reliability and proper integration of services. So I think, in fact, what we're going to see is that the telcos themselves, or in some cases, some large systems integrator players, may deliver programs which incorporate innovation and new suppliers using open technology, and that will be to the benefit of the telcos and to their customers. So I would ask you to vote against the motion.
Thank you very much, Graham. So there we have it. We've got our motion and we've got our arguments for and against. But the important thing is, what do you think? What do you, our audience, think? Are you for or against? Have your views been influenced by any of our expert witnesses, or have Chris and Graham changed your mind? Vote now. There are green and red buttons below this video, for and against. Just click the one that matches your choice. And next to that is an area for you to submit your questions for our live show, when we will continue the debate and then reveal the final motion results. Thank you to all our guests for taking part today. Very much appreciated. Don't forget, there will be 6 debates and 6 corresponding motions. Watch them all, cast your votes, then come and join us for our live end-of-year Great Telco debate. Goodbye for now.